Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the launch of our report, Dead Ends, No Path to Protection for Asylum Seekers under the Guatemala Asylum Cooperative Agreement. My name is Claire McMullen, and I will be moderating the Human Rights Institute's event today. This report documents the findings of our investigation into the legality of the US-Guatemala Asylum Cooperative Agreement and its impact on the human rights of asylum seekers. Under this agreement, non-Guatemalan citizens arriving at the United States southern border may be transferred to Guatemala on the grounds that they can lodge their claim for asylum there instead. Today, you will hear from my co-authors about the way in which this agreement violates US and international law by denying asylum seekers a viable path to seek protection in the United States or Guatemala. Teresa Hampshire will set the legal standard. Jacqueline Lewis will present our findings in the United States, and Justine Tixon will explain what happens when asylum seekers arrive in Guatemala. Next slide, please. To make our legal assessment, the research team traveled to Guatemala City in January 2020 and conducted over 50 interviews. We spoke with asylum seekers who had been returned under the agreement, predominantly Honduran and Salvadoran families with young children, as well as representatives of the Guatemalan government, civil society, and international organizations. To date, the 932 people transferred to Guatemala pursuant to this agreement have been subjected to a process that violates their human rights and fails to sufficiently protect them against a return to the dangers they are fleeing. On March 16th this year, the United States suspended this agreement due to the coronavirus, but it could be recommenced any day now. Similar agreements are waiting in the wings with both Honduras and El Salvador to push a policy approach that is a zero-sum deal for everyone. It also has the potential to be lethal. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Guatemala's Human Rights Ombudsman, Jordan Rodas, who is an esteemed human rights defender and the president of the Ibero-American Federation of Ombudsmen. I would also like to introduce Gabriela Mundo, the Director of International Relations at the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman in Guatemala. During the second part of this event, you will hear directly from Mr. Rodas and Ms. Mundo about the COVID crisis, crippling Guatemala's health system, and the consequences for Guatemala and asylum seekers of recommencing this policy. We will then open the launch for a half-hour Q&A where we want to hear from you. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the center of your screen at any time during the launch. Finally, on behalf of the co-authors, including Ashley Uren and Grace Fusco, who could not be with us today, we would like to thank everyone who contributed to this report. First, to Professor Andy Schoenholtz, who leads the Human Rights Institute here at Georgetown Law, Melissa Stewart, the Institute's Dash Muse Teaching Fellow, and our two adjunct professors, Casey Mordecai and Catherine Valencia. We thank you for your significant investment in this report. To all the people and organizations we consulted and interviewed in the United States and Guatemala, it was your generosity of time and expertise that has enabled us to penetrate the lack of transparency surrounding implementation of this agreement in both countries. A special mention to Bill Freelich from Human Rights Watch and Yael Shaka from Refugees International for their expert advice. They have recently released a report on their investigation into this agreement, Deportation with a Layover, which in combination with ours powerfully evidences a pattern of implementation and conduct by the United States and Guatemala that is unlawful across separate periods of this agreement's implementation. Most of all, we would like to thank the asylum seekers who shared their experiences with us at Casa del Migrante, the migrant house in Guatemala City. The names used today in this presentation and in our report are pseudonyms. You will hear about Damien, a Honduran teenager in high school. He was kidnapped in Honduras by a gang. He was tortured. He was set up to look like an informant. He was shot. But under the ACA, Damien and his family, like the overwhelming majority of those transferred, hit dead ends at every stage of their search for safety. It is illegal to return asylum seekers to situations where they may face persecution or where their lives may be in danger. My co-authors will now explain why.
So the Guatemala ACA falls within the Safe Third Country Agreement legal framework, and therefore we will be evaluating the agreement against those standards under US and international law. The purported purpose of a Safe Third Country Agreement is to provide a way for two countries to cooperate to share the burden of processing asylum requests so that those who need protection can access it. To accomplish this under US law, a third country can only be designated as safe if, first, the asylum seeker's life or freedom would not be threatened based on convention grounds, or they would not be tortured in the third country. This principle is also the international obligation of non-refoulement. And second, a third country can only be designated as safe if asylum seekers would have access to a full and fair asylum procedure. Finally, independent of the Guatemala ACA, the US and Guatemala must always protect human rights per their obligations under international law. We will discuss several of these rights and the ways they are implicated by the Guatemala ACA throughout the presentation today. At this time, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Jacqueline, who will discuss our findings on the Guatemala ACA as it relates to the process within the United States.
Thank you, Teresa. Our study supported three major findings regarding the implementation of the agreement in the US. First, the high burden of proof and lack of procedural safeguards fails to protect against refoulement or assess asserted fears. Second, inconsistencies in the agreement's implementation, such as the pervasive lack of notice of removal, violate the few procedural safeguards against refoulement outlined in US regulations. And finally, coercive conduct by US immigration officials poses serious due process concerns that heightens the difficulty of asserting a fear and the risk of refoulement. Next slide. First, we found that the implementation of the agreement in the US fails to protect against refoulement because asylum seekers are not provided a fair opportunity to demonstrate a protected fear of removal to Guatemala. Next slide. To avoid removal under the agreement, they must demonstrate that it is more likely than not that they will face persecution or torture in Guatemala. Notably, this is a significantly higher threshold burden of proof than asylum seekers not subject to the agreement must initially demonstrate. However, under the agreement, not only are they asked to demonstrate this higher standard, but they must do so without the right to appeal, without the right to counsel, and without an opportunity to present evidence. Next slide. For example, the evidence Damien brought with him to demonstrate the veracity of the threats to his life and family in Honduras, including photographs and documents, were never examined by US authorities, reporting that the officials did not even seem interested in seeing anything. This system is completely inadequate to protect against unlawful removals because asylum seekers are asked to demonstrate their risk of persecution or torture in Guatemala to such a high standard of proof without evidence and without counsel, which is nearly impossible. Next slide. Second, not only does the agreement fail to adequately protect against refoulement, the US has failed to consistently follow the few procedural safeguards that do exist. Next slide. The applicable US regulation requires that asylum seekers are advised of the agreement's exceptions, that asylum seekers receive written notice that they must affirmatively state a fear of removal, and that they are being transferred to Guatemala to seek asylum there. These protections are meant to ensure that these asylum seekers are not transferred when they have a valid fear of removal on a protected ground. But the US's application of these essential safeguards has been extremely inconsistent. For example, some never had the opportunity to speak to an asylum officer, and only one person we spoke with received the document that provides the written notice of removal to Guatemala. But most significantly, approximately 1/3 of the asylum seekers who participated in our study were never even told by US officials that they were going to Guatemala or why. Next slide. Some people were told nothing. Some people were told they were going home. Others believed they were being sent to Guatemala to wait as their asylum claim was processed in the US. Amelia, quoted here, said, "I was told I was going home. I thought I was going to Honduras, but I had no idea where we were going. I realized I was in Guatemala when I heard an announcement that said, 'Welcome to Guatemala City.' This announcement came while she was on an airplane landing in the La Aurora Airport in Guatemala City." One of the most obvious problems with this lack of notice is that it makes it nearly impossible to assert a fear of persecution or torture in Guatemala, particularly if you don't even know you're going there. Next slide. Finally, this problem is exacerbated by the fact that documents that asylum seekers do receive are in English and are in some cases intentionally concealed or misrepresented by US officials. Next slide. For example, as mentioned, documents are all in English, which means that many asylum seekers are reliant on US officials to explain the documents. Additionally, some asylum seekers were woken up in the middle of the night and forced to sign deportation paperwork, and reported that detention conditions contributed to their disorientation. Some officials tricked the asylum seekers into signing papers by refusing to explain the documents or intentionally misrepresenting them, or deported individuals who refused to sign deportation paperwork. Next slide. For example, in Isabella's case, the officials covered up the deportation paperwork and told her if she signed, she would be able to speak to a judge. One of the most egregious cases of this was with Damien, where he expressly asserted his fear of returning to Guatemala to officials and refused to sign any paperwork. But the officials explicitly responded that it didn't matter if he signed or not, that he was going to Guatemala. Not only do these reports raise serious due process concerns, but they increase the difficulty for asylum seekers to know that they are being removed to Guatemala and assert fear. Additionally, this coercive behavior leads to disorientation once they arrive in Guatemala that undermines their ability to seek asylum there. That ends our findings on the US implementation of the agreement. I will now hand it over to Justine to discuss what happens once asylum seekers arrive in Guatemala. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for this accurate depiction of the flows in the US system and practice under this agreement. I will now focus on the gaps and failures that we found on the Guatemalan side. And you will see that despite what the US authorities claim, there is no protection to be found in Guatemala. The maze full of dead ends only continues. Next slide, please. Our first finding relates to the arrival in Guatemala. As you will see on the next slide, when transferees arrive in Guatemala City's airport, they are confused, disoriented, exhausted, hungry, and often unwell, both from the conditions in from the detention conditions in the US and from the conditions on the airplane. While Guatemala has an obligation not to send these people back and to provide them with access to full and fair procedures, the practice is very different. Upon arrival, all they are told is that they have a mere 72 hours to make the life-changing decision of whether to pursue an asylum claim in Guatemala or to return to their home country. They are literally told you can stay or you can go, and are offered no information about how to apply for asylum. When they dare to ask for such information, they are told it's a lot of paperwork. In opposition thereto, they are strongly encouraged to return home, receiving written information about the available free rights to their home country. Knowing this, it is no surprise that in January, the General Directorate of Migration told us that out of the 97 individuals who had been returned, only 6 had applied for asylum. This practice of explicitly discouraging people in need of protection to seek such protection raises significant concerns that Guatemala is de facto refolding hundreds of people. Most transferees that we talked to felt compelled to return to their home country, despite awaiting dangers to their lives and freedoms. This not only violates US law and international standards, but it also endangers crucial human rights and strips asylum seekers of any real choice to seek asylum somewhere safe. Next slide, please. Our second finding relates to the lack of access to a full and fair asylum procedure in Guatemala. This is an essential requirement for the validity of the Guatemala ACA under US law. As UNHCR guidelines have been recognized as instructive when interpreting US law, because the US is a party to the Refugee Convention, we will use UNHCR fair and efficient standards when evaluating whether Guatemala provides access to a full and fair asylum procedure. Here, we would like to focus on 5 elements that are relevant for full and fair asylum procedures, and as you will sadly notice, none of them are fulfilled. First, there is no guidance whatsoever about the asylum system in Guatemala. The Guatemala migration laws are very hard to understand, and in practice, no written or oral guidance is given to asylum seekers. Confusion also trumps amongst essential stakeholders, as for example, we heard contradicting statements regarding whether or not it is possible to have a lawyer present during asylum interviews. Second, the authorities in charge are not easily identifiable. For example, we learned that ORMI, the International Office of Migratory Relations, conducts the first interview with individuals returned under the Guatemala ACA, even though this organ is not mentioned anywhere in the Guatemalan laws. Third, there is no independent appeals body. Here, one must be aware that in order for an asylum application to be approved in Guatemala, it needs to be reviewed by 6 ministers and high-level officials, as well as by the Vice President of the Republic, making the process overly political. Besides, when this body of high officials rejects a claim, the very same body reviews its adverse findings. Next slide, please. The fourth element here is that one cannot say that Guatemala allocates sufficient personnel and resources to its asylum bodies. ORMI, for example, is estimated to have only between 4 and 10 staff members. Reportedly, up to 750 asylum claims remain unresolved, and that was before the US started to deport hundreds of asylum seekers to Guatemala. Fifth and lastly, we can see clear deficiencies regarding human rights protection in the laws, such as the absence of any reference to the Convention Against Torture in the Guatemalan non-refoulement provision, as well as in practice. For the sake of time, I'll be short on this, but I'm happy to talk more about the very limited access to essential human rights, such as legal counsel, work, health, or adequate living conditions, despite the many efforts of civil society. If you're interested, I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A. Now, those 5 elements matter because they represent the fact that the requirements of US law for full and fair asylum procedures are not fulfilled, that UNHCR guidance is openly violated, but perhaps most importantly, that returned asylum seekers under the Guatemala ACA cannot truly seek protection in Guatemala. Next slide, please. In addition to this lack of full and fair asylum system in practice, key provisions from the Guatemalan migration laws are also not complied with. For example, key decision makers such as CONARE, the National Commission for Refugees, and the NMA, the National Migration Authority, are barely meeting, making it impossible to resolve asylum claims in a reasonable timeframe. This renders the Guatemalan asylum systems even more inadequate to be designated as offering sufficient protection under the Guatemala ACA. Next slide, please. Our third and last finding for Guatemala relates to the lack of access to durable solution in the country, contrary to UNHCR recommendations. The need for durable solutions circles back to the very purpose of the Guatemala ACA, namely that people can find protection and resettle in a safe third country. As you can see on this slide, the human rights situation in Guatemala is nothing but alarming. This means that even if asylum seekers were able to access a good asylum system, Guatemala could not be qualified as a safe third country where refugees can resettle in the longer term. And this is one of the main reasons why so many returned asylum seekers do not even consider applying for asylum in Guatemala, because they face the same danger and human rights issues as in their home country. I will now hand over to Teresa, who will tell you more about what we recommend to the US and Guatemalan governments to fight against the lack of sense of the Guatemala ACA.
Thank you, Justine. So in light of what we just mentioned, the fact that the agreement is unlawful and violates the human rights of asylum seekers, our primary recommendation is that the US and Guatemala terminate the Guatemala ACA. The ACA violates the applicable standards under US and international law because first, it seriously risks violating the principle of non-refoulement by sending asylum seekers to Guatemala whose lives or freedom may be threatened in Guatemala based on convention grounds, or where they may be subject to torture. And second, Guatemala does not have a full and fair asylum procedure, as Justine just mentioned. Additionally, through the implementation of the agreement, Guatemala and the US are at risk of violating several of their human rights obligations under international law. Because it violates these standards, the agreement fails to achieve its purported purpose, to create an efficient process through which two countries can share the burden of processing asylum requests, because it presents no real path towards protection for those asylum seekers subject to the agreement. Because the Asylum Cooperative Agreement offers no path to asylum, it must be terminated. Next slide. If not terminate, our report recommends to the US government that, at a minimum, the Guatemala ACA needs to be suspended until it is revised in line with the necessary standards under US and international law. Additionally, the accompanying US guidelines that Jackie discussed also need to be enforced and must be monitored to ensure that these standards are being followed. Next slide, please. To the Guatemalan government, we additionally have several recommendations. These recommendations exist independent of the existence of the Guatemala ACA, although their impact is heightened under the agreement as the number of asylum seekers in Guatemala increases. Ultimately, we would recommend that Guatemala provides a fair and efficient asylum process. This would include amending the migration code to protect asylum seekers and to make the asylum process one where people who need protection will be able to access that protection, as well as to bring the process as it exists on the ground in line with those protections that do exist within the migration code. Additionally, we recommend the Guatemalan government ensure information on how to access the asylum process be made easily and publicly available to asylum seekers. Finally, while asylum seekers are pursuing claims in Guatemala, we recommend the Guatemalan government better protect their rights and provide those asylum seekers with access to durable solutions, such as access to work opportunities, education, and healthcare. Now I will turn it back to Claire to transition into the next portion of our program.
Thanks, Teresa. So now to share with us the very latest on the situation in Guatemala, we have Guatemala's Human Rights Ombudsman and the Director of International Relations, Mr. Rodas and Ms. Mundo. Ms. Mundo will be translating for Mr. Rodas today, in addition to sharing her views on the agreement, so we thank them both so much for being with us. So my first question to Mr. Rodas is Guatemala is not currently accepting asylum seekers under the Asylum Cooperative Agreement due to this coronavirus. What are your main concerns should the implementation of this agreement resume? Oh, wait. Did we lose him?
¿Aló?
Got you.
Can you hear me? Buenos días. Mucho gusto saludarles. En primer lugar, como Procurador de los Derechos Humanos de Guatemala, agradezco a esta prestigiosa Universidad de Georgetown, Washington, el espacio para comentar y responder algunas interrogantes del valioso estudio. Es importante que de la academia de Estados Unidos se preocupen y ocupen de una situación tan alarmante para Guatemala y Centroamérica.
As a human rights ombudsman, I thank the University of Georgetown for this opportunity and for all the findings you made in this important study. It is really important that academics in the United States can see through this important matter.
Sí, por el COVID-19, pues está suspendido temporalmente, pero no de manera definitiva, pese a todas las ilegalidades que comparto con ustedes que han encontrado en el estudio que indicaron, tanto a nivel internacional de los convenios internacionales como la legislación guatemalteca y de Estados Unidos, según ustedes lo manifestaron.
Due to the situation of COVID, the agreement is now suspended from March 17th, but it's actually only suspended. We don't know when the flights will be retaken. I agree with you that you made in your findings that this agreement is illegal, not only to the human rights law, but from the provisions, internal provisions in Guatemala.
Pero más allá del tema de la vigencia que está suspendida temporalmente, no hay que perder de vista que responde a la política del presidente Donald Trump y que tenemos las elecciones de fin de año en Estados Unidos y esto será algo que seguramente retomará en su momento porque ha sido la bandera contra los migrantes que ha caracterizado al actual presidente de Estados Unidos.
I think that the agreement is clear that it's a policy from President Trump and it's an action against migrants. So we think that it will soon be retaken.
So, Mr. Rodas, recently you have been quite active in Guatemala's health space in campaigning your president to provide better equipment and resources to the people and to the frontline workers in the hospitals. What is that situation like at the moment? And if this agreement were to recommence, would it place lives at risk?
Dicen que usted ha estado muy activo en cuanto a la situación del coronavirus, motivando a que el presidente tome todas las acciones necesarias para proteger a los médicos y a las personas que están en primera línea en esta situación del COVID. Pero ¿qué pasaría si en algún momento se retoma el acuerdo y se vuelve a implementar? ¿Habría riesgo para las personas que regresan a Guatemala?
Sin duda alguna hay un gran riesgo porque existe actualmente para los habitantes del territorio. Lamentablemente el Estado guatemalteco se caracteriza, las instituciones son muy débiles por problemas estructurales, la desigualdad, la discriminación, el racismo, la pobreza extrema, pues eso hace que no seamos ni un país seguro para nosotros mismos y menos para las personas que pretenden tener la calidad de asilados en nuestro país. No es congruente con nuestra realidad, tenemos un Estado muy frágil, lamentablemente.
He's saying that we have really weak institutions in Guatemala. We have a systemic crisis due to poverty, inequality, and racism. So, of course, there's risk. Guatemala is not a safe third country. It's not a safe country for Guatemalans either. So of course there's risk for the people that will be returning in case the agreement is recommenced.
So Ms. Mundo, I wonder if you could tell us what has happened to the nearly 500 people who have applied for asylum in the last few years in Guatemala. Have their cases been resolved?
We have information that some of the cases have been resolved, a very small number. Sí, procurador, la pregunta era para mí, estaba dirigida para mí. Me preguntan sobre las solicitudes de asilo y refugio que han estado haciéndose en los años anteriores. Perdón. As I was saying, we know that a very few amount of the applications have been resolved. We have information that under the agreement, there have been 24 applicants to asylum, and we know that those 24 requests have not been resolved.
And what happens to those asylum seekers when they are not resolved? Do you hear about the situation in Guatemala?
The thing is that mostly civil society organizations and international cooperation has been taking the responsibilities that are supposed to be taken by the Guatemalan government. So the thing is that they're in a situation of vulnerability. We are really worried that those people, because they can't find a real solution in Guatemala, are going back to their places of origin, so they are at risk.
And in terms of the human rights protections and the situation of human rights in Guatemala, what capacity does Guatemala have to protect migrants and asylum seekers that are transferred, especially now in light of the coronavirus?
I think the authorities don't have the capacity to protect those people that are being returned to Guatemala. As the Procurador said, we have really weak institutions. We don't have the capacity to respond to these situations that are happening, especially with the coronavirus. Health system is going to be in a crisis that has no precedents.
So now I'll hand over to my teammates and to see if they have any remaining questions for Mr. Rodas or Ms. Mundo, and then we will go into a half-hour panel for the public to ask questions to the authors or to Mr. Rodas or Ms. Mundo.
I think you covered everything right in Claire, so I'm waiting to see if the audience has any questions for Mr. Rodas or Ms. Mundo, and obviously the team is happy to answer any additional question.
Mr. Rodas, is there anything you would like to tell the people in the United States about this agreement or about the situation in Guatemala currently?
Sí, sería muy importante que los actores sociales, la academia, trataran de tener una incidencia más directa en los tomadores de decisiones, tanto en el Congreso como en el Senado, y también levantar el tema de cara a la campaña, porque sin duda alguna hay solamente dos opciones: seguimos igual o peor en el tema migrantes, o procuramos tener un mejor relacionamiento, contrato digno y no inhumano como ha sido con el actual presidente Trump.
He says that he recommends that you can speak to decision makers as much as possible, to congressmen, to senators, and also that if you can raise this subject during elections, because this is a ground that cannot be the solution to what's happening with migrants. So maybe if you can speak and say about what's happening here in Guatemala with the situation in migrants, you can raise the subject, because we have the two options. We can continue with this under Trump, or we cannot. So that's what he's saying.
And my colleague Melissa has a question, I believe.
Yes, thank you so much. Mr. Rodas, when we were conducting our research in Guatemala City, we spoke with lawyers from a non-governmental organization that were working with asylum seekers. And when we told them that it was reported in the press that all but one of the asylum seekers' claims has been abandoned, they were very surprised to hear this because they had just spoken with their clients the day before. Our concern is that the Guatemalan government is considering asylum claims abandoned when in fact they have not been. Can you speak to this at all? Personal knowledge of the situation?
Procurador, le preguntan sobre la situación que cuando ellos estaban realizando el reporte, habían hablado con algunas personas sobre que había información de que habían abandonado las solicitudes de asilo. Entonces, que la preocupación es que es posible que ellos consideren, que el gobierno de Guatemala considere que las solicitudes de asilo y refugio han sido abandonadas y que las personas no tienen la información de que para el gobierno ellos ya desistieron de esa solicitud de asilo. Si puede dar su opinión al respecto.
Sí, ahí se suman por lo menos dos factores. Uno, la falta de información precisa para los solicitantes de asilo, y la otra, las condiciones actuales legales, pues lo hacen prácticamente inviable, poco posible. Entonces, las personas de Salvador, de Honduras, no tienen ningún estímulo en quedarse en un país igual o peor de inseguro que sus propios países.
He's saying that there are two things that are really important in this thing. One is the lack of information to the people that is coming to Guatemala, and the second one is the conditions that are happening now in Guatemala. And there's no reason for a person from Honduras or El Salvador to stay in Guatemala because the situation here is the same as in their countries.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a number of questions from the audience. I was going to address one of them. So we got a question from one of our students at Georgetown asking if our findings support the litigation challenging the Guatemalan Asylum Cooperative Agreement. The case name is called UTV Bar. And the question was if we think the procedural arguments about due process safeguards being violated for the statutory argument that it's inconsistent with the right to apply for asylum under the INA is stronger and more viable. Our answer is we certainly believe that our report supports the litigation, supports the petitioners in UTV Bar. It provides compelling evidence that one, the US government is not following its own rules and procedures as outlined in the interim final rule that was published in November of 2019. And two, it also controverts the statements by the US government that there was reasons for them to find that Guatemala provides access to full and fair asylum procedures. I think we outline in great detail the gaps of protection in the Guatemalan Migration Code, and then the differences between the Migration Code as written and the implementation that sort of push back the US assertions that Guatemala is able to provide adequate protection for asylum seekers. I hope that answers the question, and I'll pass it back to Claire to moderate additional questions.
Thanks, Melissa. So our next question is from, we have quite a few. Good job, guys. Ms. Feldman, have you looked into whether asylum seekers unlawfully deported to the dangerous conditions in Guatemala might have intentional infliction of emotional distress actions against the US government? Melissa, would you like to take this one?
Sure. So I don't know if the lawyers who are representing the plaintiffs in UTV Bar have looked at this from that perspective. I think they're mostly looking to first invalidate the law, but there are certainly concerns that the treatment that asylum seekers receive both in the United States in detention, as has been widely reported, does not meet humanitarian standards. Asylum seekers were not given adequate nutrition while they were kept in detention. They were not given access to medical care, and the situation by which they were removed to Guatemala was also very concerning, that they had to spend an entire night on a tarmac in a bus, and then that they were shackled while they were transported to Guatemala. And then their emotional disorientation that we write about in our report really impacted the way in which that they were able to understand the information they received once they arrived in Guatemala, to the extent that they received any information at all. So I don't know if that's a cause of action that the lawyers are pursuing about intentional infliction of emotional distress, but we are certainly concerned about the psychological impact on these asylum seekers.
Thanks, Melissa. Mr. Gonzalez asks, are you concerned about indirect refoulement on the part of Guatemala? Yes, we are very concerned about indirect refoulement on the part of Guatemala, and we actually make a number of findings to that specifically. I'll hand over to my colleague Tess if she would like to add on this front. And then we might also talk to Mr. Rodas about what he believes Guatemala's role is in relation to whether or not it is directly or de facto refouling the individuals that are transferred under this agreement.
Thank you, Claire. So as Justine presented on during her portion, this is definitely something that our report makes a finding on and is concerned about, in that when people arrive in Guatemala, both because of the way that they've been treated in the United States, but then also because of the lack of information on the asylum process, because of the way that their choices are presented to them, which are to get a free ride home immediately, to stay in the country, and then make a decision within 3 days of whether or not to pursue an asylum claim, and the information about how challenging it is to actually pursue an asylum claim, and that we know that asylum claims are challenging to pursue, given that, as Gabriela Mundo mentioned earlier, none of the claims that have been pursued under the agreement have been resolved, that these people are essentially being forced to return back to their countries, which would be returning them to places where they may be subject to torture or where their lives may be threatened based on convention categories, which would result to indirect refoulement.
Procuradora, a usted le preguntan que cuál cree que debe ser el papel del gobierno de Guatemala en esta situación de un retorno de las personas, un retorno no directo, digamos, de los ciudadanos hondureños y salvadoreños a través de Guatemala.
Bueno, no evadir la responsabilidad que se tiene como Estado, porque actualmente, lamentablemente, solamente recae la responsabilidad, o la asume, mejor dicho, la sociedad civil y la comunidad internacional. Y el gobierno guatemalteco hace poco o casi nada por los hermanos centroamericanos que pasan acá por el país.
He's saying that government in Guatemala should take responsibility for the people that are being returned to Guatemala, because now the government is giving their backs on the Central American citizens that are coming here.
And how do, Gabby, this question is to you or Mr. Rodas, how do the Guatemalan people feel about these asylum seekers being transferred to Guatemala?
Procurador, esta pregunta es para cualquiera de nosotros dos y se refiere a que cómo se siente la población en Guatemala sobre las personas que son retornadas bajo el acuerdo ACA.
Bueno, lamentablemente no ha habido una campaña que impulse a ser solidarios con los retornados centroamericanos, y más se les ha estigmatizado en su momento por algún fenómeno delincuencial que pudieran ellos tener en Guatemala, y ahora por el COVID-19. Entonces se juntan los factores y nos hace tener una actitud poco solidaria, lamentablemente.
The procurador is saying that the attitude is really worrying because we have no solidarity with the Hondurans and Salvadorans that are coming to Guatemala. There hasn't been any information on what's happening with them. There's had been this campaign stigmatizing all the people that are being returned to Guatemala because they might be criminals. And also the situation regarding COVID, it's really worrying because now they're saying these people can be positive. So there's stigma against the people that are coming to Guatemala.
So we also have a question on whether or not our research team engaged with asylum seekers who were children and whether or not they were separated from their families at the border and whether they were sent to Guatemala under this policy. So I will hand this over to one of my teammates, but I would just like to briefly say we did interview a child Damien, who is a pseudonym, but he was a teenager from Honduras who was in the 8th grade in high school. His mother fled with him and his younger brother, who was to the United States border, and when they got there, they were separated. His younger brother and Damien were separated from his mother. They were returned to Guatemala despite the fact that Damien had endured torture. And in Guatemala, when we spoke to Damien at the migrant house in Guatemala City, he planned to return to Honduras and go into hiding. He said he would go and hide and wait until his mother could save up enough money to send him and his younger brother to the United States again. This time, only he and his younger brother could go because, in his words, the United States are not taking families anymore. So he planned to leave his mother behind. I'll also hand over to Jacqueline Lewis to talk a little bit more about, the type of people that we interviewed who were predominantly families.
Right, so most of the people that we interviewed were family units. And so under the agreement also unaccompanied minors are accepted from being returned under the agreement. So the people that we spoke with who were returned under the agreement while we were in Guatemala were primarily these family units. From my understanding, I think the way that the Guatemalan government will respond to children who are returned, if they are unaccompanied, this is not under the agreement. That is typically, they will send them to the Refugio de las Niñas, which is a refuge for children where they will receive shelter and food, as well as some social services as well.
Thank you, Jackie. So this question might be to the Procurador. Mr. Horowitz asked, what discussions have taken place with other Central American governments which might assist their citizens in finding safe havens if they return to their native countries, or perhaps provide assistance to those who are remaining in Guatemala? So let me rephrase this question a little bit. And I apologize if this is not quite the direction you were going with it, but for those Guatemalans who have been returned recently from the United States, what is their situation in Guatemala?
Procurador, preguntan cuál es la situación de los guatemaltecos retornados durante la situación del COVID. Su micrófono está apagado, Procurador.
Lamentablemente ha habido poca información y campaña de sensibilización. Hay muchos guatemaltecos que por la pérdida de trabajo en Estados Unidos o México han tenido que retornar a sus comunidades y han sido recibidos de una manera hostil hasta cierto punto y siendo muy injustos porque la economía guatemalteca, el 13% del Producto Interno Bruto descansa en la remesa de los trabajadores migrantes. Regresan ahora sin trabajo y se les rechaza por ese estigma. Eso ha sido muy doloroso.
He's saying that the Guatemalans that are being returned to Guatemala are treated with hostility. We are being really ungrateful on them because some of them have lost their jobs, so they have to come back to Guatemala. And some have been subject of attacks. So we're not thanking them for all the work that they have done for the families and the country.
And we have one question here from Professor Schoenholtz, that the families deported to Guatemala spoke to our team about why they fled Honduras or El Salvador and sought asylum in the United States. And if we could share some of those stories today. I'd like to hand to Justine to share one of our stories. And there are many, many in our report.
Yeah, I was going to say it's hard to pick one because we heard so many different stories, all shocking and outraging in their singular way. I think the one that was singled out was a woman that was here with her daughter, and she was actually fleeing Honduras, if I remember correctly, because all of her brothers and sisters had been murdered, and she had received death threats, and she had proof of those death threats. They were imminent. She had talked to the police in Honduras, and nothing was happening. And as we might understand, she felt forced to flee and to seek protection. And that woman with her daughter, they were one of the, there were two of the deportees and transferees that we talked to. They were subject to the agreement. And this is only one example that you can see that people actually need protection. They have meritorious claims. It's not only economic migrants, it's not only for leisure that they're seeking protection. And under this agreement, there is simply no way for them to find protection because every avenue just ends with a dead end. And that's what we're trying to make clear over here, is that people with needs for protections do not have any avenue to express those fears and to adequately receive protection. And I'm sure that if you read the many stories in the report, you'll have the same feeling that this is just unacceptable and this is not fulfilling the essence of the right to seek asylum.
Thanks, Justine. We have an interesting question here about whether Mr. Rodas, perhaps first, and then followed up by Melissa, about the process by which this agreement has come about. So why did Guatemala agree to this asylum cooperative agreement with the United States?
Procurador, preguntan primero para usted y después a las colegas del informe que cuál cree usted que, por qué se llegó a este acuerdo entre Guatemala y Estados Unidos, ¿cuál es la razón?
Bueno, la razón es un acto de sobrevivencia política del anterior gobierno de Jimmy Morales, que quería congraciarse con Trump, y hizo dos cosas en concreto. Una, el cambio de embajada en Israel. Eso fue de los pocos países que le siguió la corriente a la política exterior en contra de lo que ha dicho Naciones Unidas. Y dos, el tema de este acuerdo de tercer país seguro, que fue un acuerdo que se negoció bajo la mesa, opaco. Es un pierde-pierde para Guatemala, a cambio de que se debilitara el apoyo de Estados Unidos hacia la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad. Sí, fue un canje, pero que a la larga no nos favoreció como país.
The procurador is saying that it was a political survival action taken by former President Jimmy Morales. He made two actions that were going to change the situation. First of all is the moving the embassy of Guatemala in Israel as the United States also did. Only a few countries made that action, and Guatemala was one of them. And the second one is to sign the agreement under really dark situations. We don't know what was negotiated. This agreement is a loss for Guatemala. It is really an action that was directed to the United States, stopped its support to the CICIG. So it was really something that affected us.
And Melissa, would you like to respond to this on behalf of our group?
So before we close, we're shortly running out of time, but Mr. Rodas, I wondered if you had any final thoughts about your concerns for this agreement. You know, it's currently paused, but I wondered if you could share what is your primary concern should the removals be resumed?
Procuradores nos indican que se está acabando el tiempo, pero quieren que usted haga una reflexión final sobre la situación del acuerdo, que si bien en este momento está suspendida, ¿cuáles son sus principales preocupaciones en este momento?
Mis preocupaciones en este momento es que tarde o temprano va a cesar esa suspensión, va a tomar vigencia y no estamos preparados como Estado para dar condiciones dignas a las personas que buscan asilo. Es un sinsentido este acuerdo. Sería importante que desde el gobierno actual del doctor Yamatei se reflexionara y se negociara de igual a igual como Estados, no sin una sumisión, porque la verdad que tan soberanos Estados Unidos como Guatemala y merecemos respeto y un trato digno entre países que si bien tenemos una relación comercial, pero políticamente no debe de ser con una subordinación de nuestro país hacia los intereses del gobierno de turno, que en este caso está afectando a muchos connacionales y centroamericanos.
The procurador says that his main concern now is that sooner or later the agreement will be retaken and flights will be coming to Guatemala with Honduran and Salvadorian citizens. He's saying that this agreement is nonsense. He says that probably sometime soon, Yamatei government should be renegotiating this agreement. He recommends that the government do so because we have the right to be treated as equal countries. No matter that we have a commercial relationship with the United States, as a political relationship could be done with respect. And I might like to add on my behalf that the situation here with the COVID and the health workers is really worrying. The health workers are not being paid. The situations in the hospital is really, really in a crisis. So with all this that is happening in the hospitals and the health workers, the agreement recommencing is really a particular situation that worries us.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mondo and Mr. Rodas, for joining us today and engaging in this conversation and adding so much. You brought so much knowledge and expertise and gave up your valuable time to us in Guatemala and made us feel like friends. And we completely appreciate everything that you are doing in Guatemala and in sharing and giving up the little time that you even had today to come and share these thoughts with everyone here. On behalf of our whole team and all the listeners, we would like to say thank you. And now we are out of time, but you will all receive the report that we have released today. You should receive an email at 2:01, which it is currently tells me it is right now. So thank you so much for attending. To those whose questions we did not quite get to, please don't hesitate to reach out to Melissa at the Human Rights Institute or to myself. We will make our emails available. We are more than happy to speak to you about this agreement. This is not the way forward for America. This is a dead end. There is no pathway to protection here for asylum seekers. And continuing this approach will continue to put lives in danger and potentially be lethal, not just for Guatemala, but for the region. Thank you for attending today.
Muchas gracias a todas. Muy amable. Un fuerte abrazo. Sí, dice mucho.
Thank you, Mr. Rodas.
Thank you.